In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the United States Army stumbled upon one of the most feared weapons of the German arsenal, the Königstiger, or Tiger II. Nicknamed the King Tiger by Allied troops, it was the pinnacle of German armored engineering. Immense, heavily armored, and armed with an 88 mm cannon capable of destroying any tank in existence at that time. To soldiers who faced it in battle, it seemed almost invincible, a steel fortress rolling across the fields of Europe. But when American engineers finally got their hands on one and tried to drive it themselves, they learned a hard truth about German perfectionism. The captured Tiger II sat in a muddy clearing near Kassel, surrounded by American trucks and curious GIs. Its paint was scorched from battle, and the smell of burnt oil hung in the air. Yet even in defeat, the tank looked imposing, nearly 70 tons of riveted arrogance. American engineers from the Ordnance Department were tasked with examining it. They wanted to know how this monster worked, what made it deadly, and perhaps most importantly, why so many had been abandoned intact. When they opened the engine hatch, they were met by a sight both impressive and absurd. The massive Maybach HL 230 engine gleamed with precision, an intricate piece of craftsmanship, but one that looked more suited to a showroom than a battlefield. It was a complex symphony of pipes, cables, and valves, meticulously arranged but painfully delicate. The Americans quickly realized that any tank requiring this much attention in the field couldn't survive the chaos of war. They decided to test it. Fuel was brought in, the starter engaged, and after several sputters, the Maybach roared to life. The sound was deafening, powerful, but strained. The tank trembled as the massive engine fought to move its immense weight. Slowly, the Tiger II began to roll forward, tracks grinding against the muddy ground. The Americans watched in awe. For all its problems, the machine was undeniably formidable. Its turret turned with heavy precision, its gun cutting through the morning air like a blade. The engineers drove it around the test ground, noting its handling, its sluggish acceleration, and its appetite for fuel. Every turn required brute strength, every gear changed a struggle. One officer wrote in his notebook, "Beautifully built and utterly impractical." Then came the moment of truth. They approached a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow stream, a simple test of mobility. The bridge had supported Sherman tanks before without issue. The Tiger II's driver hesitated, checking the structure. It creaked under the first few inches of movement. The Americans urged him on. They wanted to know how far it could go. The moment the tank's front tracks touched the bridge, the wood began to crack. When the front half of the vehicle rolled over the edge, there was a sharp, echoing crack, and then a deafening roar of splintering timber. The bridge collapsed in an instant, sending the Tiger II's nose dipping into the stream. Mud and water sprayed high into the air as the massive machine sank, its rear still on the embankment, engine whining helplessly. The engineers jumped back, startled, then burst into laughter and disbelief. The most powerful tank in the world, the one that had terrified Allied troops, couldn't even cross a bridge built for common Shermans. It took an entire recovery crew nearly 2 days to pull it out. The Tiger II had sunk deep into the mud, its sheer weight turning the soft ground into a trap. When they finally dragged it free, one of the engineers simply shook his head. "Now we know why they left them behind," he said. "You can win a tank duel with this thing, but you'll lose a war trying to move it." That day, the Americans wrote down their findings. The Tiger II's armor was nearly impenetrable, its gun unmatched. But its flaws were fatal. It was too heavy for most bridges, too complex to repair easily, and too fuel-hungry for Germany's dwindling resources. For every Tiger II the Germans built, the Allies could field 5 Shermans or T-34s, and that was what decided the outcome of the war. When the engineers filed their final report, they concluded that the Tiger II was an engineering marvel, but also a masterpiece of overconfidence. It was a tank built for perfection, not practicality. As the sun set over the ruined German countryside, the broken bridge still sagged under the weight of splintered wood and twisted steel. The Tiger II, now motionless in the mud, looked less like a weapon of terror and more like a monument to the fatal flaw of its creators, believing that power alone could conquer reality. The Americans drove away, leaving the giant behind. The cold wind swept through the empty clearing, carrying with it the quiet lesson of that day. Sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. When the Tiger II was finally hauled out of the mud, its tracks scarred and dripping, the American engineers gathered around it once again. The bridge collapse had turned into an unintentional demonstration of exactly what made the German war machine both magnificent and disastrous. What they had seen was not just a failure of one tank, but the failure of an entire philosophy, a belief that precision engineering alone could win a war. They towed the tank to a nearby testing ground, where mechanics and ordnance officers began a systematic inspection. The massive vehicle towered over everything else around it, a symbol of both brilliance and excess. Every weld, every plate, every component was analyzed. It was clear that the Tiger II had been built by men obsessed with perfection. The armor, nearly 180 millimeters thick at its front, was angled and polished with meticulous precision. The interior, however, told another story. Cramped, overheated, and riddled with fragile wiring and delicate fittings that had no place in battlefield conditions. When the Americans examined the gearbox, they found it worn down to its limit after only a few hundred kilometers of use. The transmission was beautifully crafted, but completely over-engineered. Even in pristine condition, it could barely handle the tank's enormous weight. German crews had called it their iron coffin, not because of its armor, but because it often broke down in combat and could not be recovered under fire. The Maybach engine, the heart of the Tiger II, had its own problems. The Americans measured its power output, comparing it to their own tanks. On paper, the German engine was powerful, nearly 700 horsepower, but when tasked with moving 70 tons of armor, even that seemed inadequate. The Tiger II moved like a battleship on land, majestic but slow, devouring fuel faster than supply lines could deliver it. During the tests, the engineers attempted to drive it up a small incline. The ground was frozen, but not particularly steep. The tank's tracks slipped and spun, clawing uselessly at the dirt. When it finally reached the top, the engine was howling, temperatures rising dangerously. "It's fighting itself," one of the testers remarked. "Every part of this machine is straining just to keep the rest moving." Later that afternoon, a jeep arrived carrying new observers, officers from the U.S. Army's Armored Board. They had heard about the bridge incident and came to see the German wonder tank for themselves. The engineers demonstrated how the Tiger II could pivot in place, how its turret rotated with hydraulic force, how its gun stabilized and fired. The visitors were impressed, at least for a moment. Then the lead mechanic asked one of the officers to stand near the rear armor while the tank idled. The officer obliged, and within minutes he was nearly asphyxiated. The exhaust fumes were overwhelming, seeping into the tank's own crew compartment through poorly designed ventilation. "You'd die faster from the air than from enemy fire," another observer muttered. The room fell quiet. That evening, as snow began to fall again over the testing yard, the Americans shut down the engine and stood back. The Tiger II, even motionless, seemed alive. A sleeping giant built for a war Germany could no longer sustain. Its imposing silhouette was a testament to the brilliance of its designers and the blindness of their ambition. One of the engineers noted in his journal that night, "This tank is the perfect metaphor for the Reich, too heavy to move, too proud to adapt." And yet, even in failure, the Americans couldn't help but feel respect for it. They knew that somewhere in this machine's steel bones was a lesson about innovation, about arrogance, and about the limits of human design. By the end of the day, the Tiger II sat once again in silence, its armor gleaming faintly under a thin layer of frost. It was a machine that could crush anything in its path, except its own weight. The next morning, the American engineers returned to the testing site, the air sharp with frost and diesel fumes. The Tiger II sat waiting, a sleeping giant in the pale winter sun. Its tracks were half embedded in the frozen mud, its immense turret casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly across the ground. They began the second round of trials. This time, they wanted to understand how the tank performed on different terrain, the kind of ground it would have faced during the war. Across the test field, they had arranged obstacles: a muddy slope, a shallow trench, and a section of rough, uneven ground. A Sherman tank waited nearby for comparison, its crew lounging casually, confident in the machine's reliability. When the Americans climbed into the Tiger II and started the Maybach engine again, the roar echoed across the valley. The tank lurched forward, heavy and unsteady. Every gear change came with a shudder. As it approached the muddy incline, the driver gave it more throttle. The treads dug deep, churning up clumps of dirt, but the machine barely crawled upward. Its immense weight pressed the mud flat beneath it until it hardened like concrete. The tank strained, the engine whining with mechanical protest. Then halfway up the slope, the treads spun uselessly, and the Tiger began to slide backward. The engineers scrambled to halt it, throwing it into reverse, but the sheer inertia made control impossible. When the tank finally stopped, they could smell burning oil and overheated metal. One mechanic climbed out and looked at the tracks. "It's too much," he said. "This thing isn't built for the real world." To prove the point, they brought up the Sherman. The smaller, lighter tank ascended the same hill with ease. It wasn't graceful, but it was efficient, a workhorse rather than a monument. The comparison was undeniable. The Tiger II was a masterpiece of engineering on paper, but a liability on the battlefield. Back at the test site, the Americans continued their inspection. They studied the drive system, noting how every component seemed to have been designed with exacting precision but little thought for mass production. Replacement parts would have been impossible to make quickly. Even minor repairs required specialized tools and hours of labor. One of the older mechanics, who had worked on Sherman engines since North Africa, shook his head. "If one of these broke down in the field," he said, "you'd need a factory to fix it." That was the truth the Germans had learned too late. By 1944, their tanks were marvels of technology, but their factories were being bombed daily, their resources stretched to the limit. Meanwhile, the Americans and Soviets were building simpler machines by the thousands. The Americans decided to push the Tiger II harder. They ran it across the rough terrain section, broken logs, frozen soil, uneven ground. The tank thundered forward, crushing everything beneath it. The sound was deafening, metal grinding against rock, engines roaring under strain. For a few minutes, it looked unstoppable again. Then came the inevitable, a loud echoing crack, followed by the whine of a failing gear. The right track locked up. The engineers halted the test. Steam rose from the engine compartment, and hydraulic fluid leaked across the ground. They opened the hatch to find the gearbox damaged, another victim of the tank's own mass. The field report that afternoon was grim. The Tiger II's speed barely reached 20 kilometers per hour on rough ground. Its transmission couldn't handle prolonged stress. Its fuel consumption was catastrophic, burning through hundreds of liters per hour. It was, in the words of one report, an iron cathedral, magnificent but doomed. As the men packed up for the day, the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. The Tiger II sat motionless, its massive gun pointed uselessly at the sky. It was a symbol of a nation that had built for glory, not survival, and had paid the price. That night, the lead engineer wrote one final line in his notebook before closing it. The Tiger II was not defeated by the enemy. It was defeated by itself. The next phase of testing took the Americans to a different site, a long concrete bridge outside Frankfurt, built to withstand heavy military vehicles. It was the perfect place to test what had become a running joke among the engineers: whether the Tiger II could actually cross a bridge without breaking it. The tank had already proven its immense weight to be a curse. At nearly 70 tons, it was heavier than most locomotives of the time. The Americans had calculated the bridge's load limit at about 60 tons. In theory, it might just hold. In practice, no one was certain. Early in the morning, they towed the Tiger II to the base of the bridge with the help of 2 recovery vehicles. Frost still coated the steel girders, and the river below was half frozen. The tank loomed like a beast waiting to be unleashed. Its broad tracks left deep impressions in the dirt road leading up to the bridge, like scars in the earth itself. The driver climbed inside. The Maybach engine coughed to life, belching thick smoke that drifted into the cold air. Slowly, the tank rolled forward. The engineers stood back, watching every creak of the bridge's structure, listening for the faintest groan of stress. At first, everything seemed fine. The Tiger II moved steadily across the planks, its engine echoing through the valley. But then the steel beams began to shudder. Bolts groaned under pressure, and a hollow metallic wail echoed through the air. The tank had reached the midpoint when the first cracks appeared. Hairline fractures in the concrete supports. The driver stopped instantly. "Back it up!" someone shouted. The driver tried, but the tank hesitated, gears grinding under strain. The bridge sagged slightly. Then, with a deep, thunderous snap, one of the beams gave way. The right track dropped several inches, sending the tank tilting dangerously to one side. Everyone froze. For a terrifying moment, it looked as if the entire bridge might collapse. Somehow, the driver managed to reverse inch by inch until the Tiger II finally crawled back to solid ground. The moment its rear tracks touched the riverbank, the damaged section of the bridge gave way completely, crashing into the icy water below. Silence followed, except for the ticking of the tank's engine cooling down. The Americans stood in disbelief. A bridge that had carried columns of Shermans and supply trucks without issue had just been destroyed by a single German tank. One of the engineers exhaled and muttered, "It's not a tank. It's a mobile disaster." The incident was carefully documented. The test notes read, "Vehicle weight exceeds practical combat logistics. Structural failure likely under standard field conditions." In simpler terms, the Tiger II couldn't go anywhere without breaking something. Later that afternoon, they performed one last mobility test on open ground. They wanted to see how far the tank could travel before running out of fuel. The answer came faster than expected. After just 30 kilometers, the massive engine sputtered to a stop. Fuel tanks drained, filters clogged, the Tiger II sat silent again. The Americans stared at it for a moment, then burst into quiet laughter. They were beginning to see why German troops had abandoned so many of these machines during their retreat. It wasn't Allied firepower that stopped them. It was physics. Still, no one could deny the craftsmanship. When the engineers inspected the gun breech, they were awed by its precision. The 88mm KWKR-43 cannon was perfectly machined, its rifling immaculate. It was capable of piercing any Allied tank at more than 2 kilometers. "It's a masterpiece," one officer said, "trapped inside its own armor." That evening, they parked the Tiger II beside a Sherman for comparison. The two machines could not have been more different. The American tank was simple, functional, and light, designed to move and fight. The German tank was elegant, intricate, and immovable, designed to dominate. As the sun set, the Tiger II stood motionless, framed against the fading light like a relic of a bygone empire. For all its power, it could not escape its own limitations. And as the Americans left the site, one of them turned back for a final glance. The tank stood alone on the riverbank, a monument to the idea that sometimes even brilliance can collapse under its own weight. The following week, the Americans moved the Tiger II to a controlled proving ground near Versailles, France, a wide expanse of frozen earth once used for aircraft testing. Here they intended to push the tank to its limits, to document once and for all the reality behind the myth that had haunted Allied tank crews for years. The tank was still coated in dried mud from the bridge collapse. Its armor bore scars of combat and testing, but it remained imposing, a hulking mass of steel that looked invincible even when standing still. The U.S. Ordnance Corps had brought in additional personnel, including engine specialists and ballistics experts. Their mission: test every aspect of the Tiger II, from its mechanical endurance to its legendary gun. The first challenge was getting it started again. The mechanics struggled for nearly an hour in the cold morning air. The Maybach engine coughed, sputtered, and then finally caught with a violent roar. Thick black smoke poured from the exhaust, blanketing the test field in a haze of fumes. It was an impressive sight, but already several engineers exchanged worried glances. The engine temperature rose too fast, the oil pressure fluctuated wildly, and one of the cooling fans began to vibrate dangerously. Once the tank was ready, the mobility test began. It crept forward across the frozen field, leaving deep gouges in the earth behind it. The Americans timed its acceleration. 0 to 20 kilometers per hour took nearly 20 seconds. On turns, the outer track slipped constantly. The steering system groaned under the weight. When they stopped, the brakes screamed. The engineers kept notes meticulously. "Every movement feels forced," one wrote. "No margin for error. If a single component fails, the whole machine stops. Then came the range test. They had brought in a row of derelict armored hulls, old Shermans, Panzer IIIs, and even a T-34. The Tiger II's gun was its greatest strength, and they wanted to see if it lived up to its reputation. When the loader chambered the first round and fired, the shock wave rolled across the field like thunder. The shell tore through the distant Sherman as if it were paper. The engineers stood in awe. The 88mm cannon was breathtaking, precise, stable, and devastating. It could destroy any tank in the world with ease. But as they fired more rounds, another problem surfaced. The recoil strained the turret mechanism, and the hydraulics leaked. The system was simply too delicate for the weapon it carried. Every shot brought more wear. The tank was breaking itself with its own power. After several hours of testing, the Tiger II had burned through hundreds of liters of fuel and was running hot. When they shut it down, steam hissed from the engine compartment. The Americans opened the rear hatch, and the smell of scorched oil filled the air. One of them tapped the thick armor plate and said quietly, "They built a fortress, not a tank." That evening, the team gathered to discuss their findings. The consensus was clear. The Tiger II was one of the most formidable tanks ever designed, on paper. But in the real world, it was a logistical nightmare. It consumed too much fuel, demanded too much maintenance, and required bridges that didn't exist. The war in Europe had shown that mobility and reliability mattered more than raw power. A Sherman might not win in a one-on-one duel, but it could cross a river, climb a hill, and keep fighting the next day. The Tiger II, for all its grandeur, could not. Before leaving the proving ground, the Americans parked the tank in an open hangar. Its immense gun pointed toward the empty sky, and its treads rested deep in frozen mud. The engineers stood for a moment in silence. They had uncovered the truth about the monster that had terrorized the front lines, and it wasn't what they expected. In the end, the Tiger II wasn't beaten by Allied firepower. It was beaten by its own design. The engineers knew it, and somewhere, the men who had once built it must have known it too. The next morning, when the Americans returned, frost had formed on the tank's hull. The once feared beast now looked like a monument, cold, heavy, and utterly still. It had conquered everything except itself. The Tiger II sat quietly in the hangar the next morning, its massive silhouette framed by a pale beam of winter sunlight. The Americans gathered once again, their breath visible in the frigid air. They were preparing for the final series of tests, this time focusing on maintenance and field repair. They wanted to see what it truly took to keep such a machine operational in combat conditions. Even before the test began, the engineers could see the problem. The moment they opened the rear engine hatch, the temperature inside the tank had already frozen several of the fuel lines solid. The Maybach HL230P30 engine, designed for power and precision, was also incredibly fragile. It required careful heating and constant supervision just to function in cold weather. A Sherman, by comparison, could be started in minutes with little more than a crank and some patience. The team began simulating a battlefield repair scenario. They pretended the transmission had failed, a common occurrence for the Tiger II during the war, and attempted to remove it. Within an hour, the engineers were shaking their heads. To extract the gearbox, the turret had to be removed entirely, and the entire rear of the tank disassembled. In real combat, that meant days of immobility, vulnerable to airstrikes or artillery fire. One of the American mechanics finally said aloud what everyone had been thinking. No wonder they abandoned them. You'd need a whole factory to keep one running. Later, they conducted a comparative study using parts from captured German workshops. The Tiger II's components were finely machined to exact tolerances, requiring near-perfect alignment. The Americans were astonished. Every bolt, every plate, every bearing was over-engineered. Even a minor misalignment could cause catastrophic failure. It was clear now. The Tiger II was built like a masterpiece, but it wasn't built for war. That afternoon, the engineers decided to drive it again to record fuel efficiency. They filled its tanks to the brim, loaded ammunition and ballast for realism, and sent it out on a circular test road around the airfield. For several minutes, it performed well. The sound of its engine echoed across the frozen plain, deep and rhythmic. Its turret turned smoothly, its suspension absorbing the uneven ground. For a moment, the Americans understood why German crews had once loved it. It felt indestructible. But after only a few miles, the signs of strain returned. The engine temperature rose alarmingly. The tank slowed, then began to sputter. They stopped and opened the hatch. The radiators were leaking, the fan belts slipping. Within minutes, the massive machine was immobilized once again. It had burned through almost 150 gallons of fuel, for a distance barely worth reporting. That evening, the engineers gathered around the field stove, reviewing the day's data. No one spoke for a while. The sheer inefficiency of the Tiger II had stunned even the most experienced among them. Finally, one of the younger engineers broke the silence. "It's strange," he said. "We were afraid of this thing. Now, seeing it like this, I almost feel sorry for it." The senior officer nodded. "That's what happens when you build for pride instead of purpose." Outside, the Tiger II sat beneath the darkening sky, steam rising from its cooling engine. The snow began to fall again, settling gently on its turret and hull. The once mighty King Tiger looked less like a weapon now and more like a relic, a ghost from a war that had already moved on. By the end of the week, the Americans prepared to ship it to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for long-term study. The massive tank would make the journey by rail, carried in sections because no single flat car could bear its weight. As the workers began to load it, one of them turned back for a final glance. "They built it to win the war," he said quietly, "but it couldn't even win against a bridge." The others said nothing. They simply watched as the King Tiger, once Germany's proudest creation, was chained down and covered with canvas, bound for a foreign land. Its final journey had begun. When the Tiger II finally arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States, it drew a crowd unlike any other piece of captured equipment. American tank crews, engineers, and even civilian visitors gathered to see the fabled King Tiger, the tank that had once been the terror of Europe. It arrived disassembled, its massive hull and turret loaded separately on rail cars, still caked with German mud and oil. The U.S. Army Ordnance Corps reassembled it piece by piece, studying every bolt and weld as if unlocking a code. The process took nearly 2 weeks, and when it was complete, the machine once again stood whole, an iron monument to Germany's industrial obsession. The Americans ran a full systems analysis. They examined the 88mm KWK-43 gun with reverence. Its precision was unmatched. They studied the interleaved road wheels, a marvel of suspension engineering that provided excellent stability, but at the cost of endless maintenance. When clogged with mud or ice, it could seize entirely. The cooling system, though clever, was overly complex and prone to leaks. Everything about the tank screamed brilliance and fragility. Once the Tiger II was operational, Aberdeen scheduled its first American field demonstration. Soldiers gathered on the observation deck as the tank rumbled to life. Its deep, throaty growl echoed across the proving grounds. When it began to move, the ground vibrated. To the untrained eye, it was a spectacle of power, a machine that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But the engineers were watching more closely. The engine temperature was already rising. The fuel gauge was dropping fast. The gears whined with strain. After just 15 minutes of operation, the tank began to slow. The driver reported overheating. The technicians rushed forward and shut it down. Steam hissed from the vents like a wounded animal. They let the machine cool, then ran diagnostic tests. The results were the same as in Europe. Efficiency was abysmal, reliability non-existent. The tank's design demanded the kind of precision maintenance that only a factory could provide, not a battlefield crew. Despite its failures, the Americans were fascinated. The Tiger II became an object of study, not ridicule. They measured its armor, an astonishing 180 millimeters at the front, and fired various weapons at it to test penetration. The results were sobering. Even high-velocity rounds from Allied guns often failed to penetrate at range. Against a Sherman or a Churchill, it was virtually invulnerable from the front. But when they hit its sides and rear, the story changed. The armor was thinner, and the tank's massive weight made maneuvering slow and predictable. A fortress with blind spots, one report called it. The Ordnance Corps' final evaluation was blunt. The Tiger II was a tank of extraordinary firepower and protection, rendered tactically ineffective by poor mobility and logistical impossibility. It was the most powerful tank in the world, and yet one that had nowhere to go. In the weeks that followed, Aberdeen engineers compared it directly to American designs. They concluded that a single Tiger II required as much material, manpower, and fuel as 5 M4 Shermans. And 5 Shermans, they noted, could fight, move, and support each other, while one Tiger sat stranded with a broken gearbox or an empty fuel tank. The German philosophy had built a masterpiece. The American philosophy had built a winner. As the test concluded, the tank was moved to a storage hangar, its tracks frozen in place by rust and time. A layer of dust began to settle on its gun barrel. The King Tiger, once the symbol of invincibility, had been humbled not by enemy fire, but by its own perfectionism. Years later, long after the war, the tank still sat at Aberdeen, silent, immovable, an artifact of a lost era. American engineers would bring cadets to see it, pointing out its brilliance and its flaws. "It's what happens," one instructor would say, "when you forget that war is fought with logistics as much as with steel." The Tiger II had been the ultimate weapon until it met reality. By the early 1950s, the Tiger II had become less a weapon of war and more a study in what war had taught engineers about failure. The Americans at Aberdeen had moved on to new projects: jet engines, guided missiles, and the first prototypes of what would become the M48 Patton. Yet in one corner of the proving grounds, under a corrugated steel roof and a fading coat of snow, the captured German giant still sat, quiet, cold, and intimidating, even in decay. A group of young engineering officers visited it that winter as part of a post-war technology review. None of them had fought in Europe. To them, the Tiger II was history, a myth made of metal. But when they climbed the ladder to peer inside the turret, they fell silent. The cramped interior told its own story, of crews who had fought not only their enemies, but their own machine. Gauges, levers, switches, and valves filled every inch of space. The smell of aged oil and rust lingered, like a ghost of the Eastern Front. One officer flipped through the archived German maintenance manual that lay beside the tank. It was over 300 pages long, full of intricate diagrams and cautions written in precise Gothic script. To keep this machine running, it required discipline, bordering on devotion. Every line revealed a truth the Americans already knew. The Tiger II was a masterpiece that demanded worship, not use. They began another round of static tests, focusing this time on the materials themselves. Metallurgists cut samples from the armor plates, analyzing the composition. What they found was surprising. The steel was incredibly strong, almost too strong. Its hardness made it brittle under repeated stress. On the battlefield, it meant that even a glancing shot could cause microfractures that grew over time, weakening the very armor that had once seemed invincible. Other teams studied the suspension and the overlapping wheel system that the Germans had considered revolutionary. It gave excellent stability, but in muddy or icy terrain, it trapped debris and froze solid. Clearing it took hours. The Americans documented each flaw meticulously, knowing that future designs would depend on these lessons. The Tiger II, for all its grandeur, had been the embodiment of what not to build again. It was proof that the war's greatest threat had been as self-destructive as it was fearsome. As reports circulated through the Ordnance Department, the tone shifted from curiosity to reflection. The German engineers had chased perfection while their enemies had mastered practicality. The Tiger II was the ultimate paradox, over-designed to the point of failure. Still, it was impossible not to admire it. Standing beside it, one could feel its weight, its menace, its beauty. It looked less like a tank and more like a cathedral of steel, something crafted for eternity, not survival. That spring, Aberdeen hosted a demonstration for visiting military officials from Britain and Canada. They walked around the Tiger II in silence, each man measuring it with a professional eye. The American guide explained how the tank's fuel consumption had crippled its mobility, how bridges collapsed under it, how it could barely travel 50 miles before breaking down. A Canadian colonel finally spoke. "Magnificent," he said, "but utterly useless." The group nodded, and they moved on to newer machines. Lighter, faster, smarter. By the time summer came, the Tiger II was left alone again, the grass growing up around its tracks. Rain seeped into the seams, Rust crept over its once polished armor. But even as it decayed, it commanded respect. Visitors would pause before it, dwarfed by its bulk, and imagine what it must have felt like to see such a monster rolling toward them in 1944. And yet, those who truly understood engineering would always see something different. They saw not power, but irony, not dominance, but fragility. In the silence of the proving ground, the Tiger II remained what it had always been, a warning in the form of a machine. By the late 1950s, the Tiger II had become more than an artifact. It had become a teacher. Every engineer who passed through Aberdeen's research program studied it, not as a trophy, but as a case study in the limits of ambition. The Cold War was in full force now, and new American tanks like the M60 were taking shape. Yet every new generation of designers looked back at the German colossus that had failed to live up to its legend. For many, it represented the difference between theory and practice. On paper, the Tiger II was perfect. Thick armor, an unmatched gun, and engineering precision bordering on art. But in reality, that perfection had trapped it. Each improvement added weight. Each layer of sophistication made it more fragile. It was a warning written in the steel, proof that complexity could be as deadly as enemy fire. That winter, a restoration team briefly considered running the tank again. Its engine had long since seized, but they wanted to record the original Maybach sound. They disassembled components carefully, lubricated the bearings, checked the transmission, and replaced the oil. But the further they worked, the more they realized how impractical it would be. The parts were hand-fitted, impossible to replace without German workshops that no longer existed. After 2 weeks of effort, they gave up. The Tiger II would never roar again. It would remain silent, its great heart frozen forever. Meanwhile, military historians began to gather first-hand accounts from both German and Allied tank crews. The stories painted a clearer picture. When the Tiger II first appeared on the battlefield, it caused terror. Its armor shrugged off shells, its gun destroyed tanks from over a mile away. But the fear faded once Allied soldiers realized how rare and immobile it really was. Many Tiger IIs were abandoned intact, their engines broken or out of fuel. Others were destroyed not by enemy fire, but by their own crews, forced to prevent capture when the machines failed to move. American engineers now understood the bitter irony. The Tiger II had been a weapon built for a war Germany could no longer afford to fight. Every ton of steel, every drop of fuel poured into one of these machines was a resource not spent on the thousands of simpler, cheaper vehicles that might have changed the outcome. As the U.S. Army compiled their final evaluations, the report's tone was almost philosophical. It stated plainly that a tank must live with the terrain, not fight against it. The Tiger II had done the opposite. It had defied nature and logistics alike, and it had lost. In one of the final test notes, an American officer wrote, "The Tiger II was never defeated by an enemy tank. It was defeated by gravity, mud, and time." By then, the great tank had begun to rust through in places. Rainwater seeped into its gun barrel, and grass grew up between its tracks. Birds nested in its turret. Its once glistening armor dulled to a dark orange-brown, blending into the earth it could never conquer. And yet, even in decay, it was majestic. Standing beside it, one could almost hear the echo of its engine, the thunder of its gun, the fear it once inspired. But the awe was tinged with sadness. This was no longer a weapon. It was a monument to wasted genius. For American engineers, it remained the perfect contradiction, a triumph of engineering and a failure of design philosophy. They learned from it, and in doing so, ensured that no tank that followed would ever make the same mistake. The Tiger II had been built to last forever, but in truth, it had lasted only long enough to teach the world what not to build. Decades passed. The war that had once forged machines like the Tiger II faded into memory, and the proving grounds at Aberdeen transformed into a museum of mechanical evolution. Rows of tanks from every era stood under open skies, from the slender Shermans and Pershings to the hulking Soviet Wurt-Arn Alciries, and among them, still towering above the rest, the Tiger II. Its armor, once flawless and cold, now bore the marks of time. Rust streaked down from the bolts, moss grew along its treads, and birds perched on the barrel of its mighty 88mm gun. Yet even in its stillness, it demanded attention. Visitors who knew little of tank warfare would stop before it, whispering at its size, feeling that same quiet reverence that soldiers once felt when it appeared on the horizon. But for those who understood what it represented, the Tiger II was more than a machine. It was a parable written in steel. American engineers, now old men, would occasionally return to the site, standing silently before the German monster they had studied long ago. They remembered the day it failed to cross a simple wooden bridge, the day its engine seized, the day it proved that brilliance without practicality was its own kind of weakness. One of them, now gray-haired and stooped, once remarked during a museum lecture, "The Tiger II didn't lose because it was weak. It lost because it was too perfect. In war, perfection is fragile." He paused, letting his words sink in. The Shermans, the T-34s, even the Churchills, they were ugly, crude, sometimes unreliable. But they worked. They could cross rivers, scale muddy slopes, be repaired in the field. They were alive. The Tiger II was art, and art doesn't survive the battlefield. Outside, a light snow began to fall, blanketing the rows of steel relics. The Tiger II sat beneath it, silent and immovable, its massive frame blending with the white landscape, a frozen echo of the war it had once fought. The engineers who had studied it were gone now, their reports yellowed with age, their lessons absorbed into every tank that came after. Modern machines like the M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2 carried the opposite philosophy: mobility over weight, efficiency over complexity. Each of them, in some way, owed their design to the failures of the Tiger II. And so, the captured German giant had left a strange legacy. It never crossed a bridge without breaking it, never traveled far without faltering, never truly lived up to its promise. Yet it had changed how nations built their tanks forever. In the fading light of evening, the museum caretaker locked the gates and glanced once more at the towering silhouette of the Tiger II. The wind whispered through the empty proving ground, carrying with it a faint metallic creak, as if the old beast still breathed beneath its armor. It had been the ultimate creation of German engineering, a masterpiece of ambition and pride. But it was the cold logic of reality, the bridge that cracked under its weight, that had written its final chapter. The Americans had not defeated the Tiger II with bullets, but with understanding. And that understanding, the truth that no weapon, no matter how perfect, could overcome its own flaws, became the quiet victory that outlived the war. As the snow thickened, the tank disappeared beneath a white shroud, a ghost of iron and arrogance, resting at last among the machines it had once outshined. The king had fallen, and in doing so, it had taught the world how to build empires that wouldn't. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.